people, the lifestyle, the lakes, the snow, everything's close by.
On ABC Radio Canberra, this is Paula Kruger.
Imagine you're at your desk at work and it's Valentine's Day. Let's assume you're single as well, just to make it less complicated. And imagine that something is left on your desk. A rose, a card in the shape of a love heart. Maybe it's anonymous, but it's from someone in the office. Love is always tricky, and yes, it does hurt. But in the workplace, let's face it, it's a potential minefield. Well, take a breath and lean in and listen, because this is the survival guide to workplace romance. HR specialist Karen Gately is founder of Corporate Dojo, and she joins us now. Karen, we all need a straight-talking friend in these situations. I'm hoping that that is you, because there's not a lot of guidelines around when it comes to relationships in the workplace. Why is that?
Yeah, look, I think that we're all aware of some of the risks, obviously. So most organisations have, the sexual harassment policies and those kinds of things that educate people. But often there's just not the conversation on a really pragmatic level around, the reality that people do get involved with one another at work at times. And, there's many, many people who find their life partner in the office. So I just don't think there's enough education and conversation around how do we deal with these situations in a really responsible, professional way. Some businesses, I think, are naive to try and actually ban people, falling for each other and getting into that relationship.
And Karen, you've come up with 5 top things you should be aware of when approaching an office romance. Take us through them. Number 1, be discreet.
Yeah, again, it's about recognising that you are actually at work, and, people don't necessarily want to be aware of all of your personal issues or challenges or even likes. People getting very loved up in them, in the office is not necessarily going to be seen as professional and conducive to getting our work done. So, it's not about hiding the relationship. It's just about not having that relationship in everyone's faces while they're trying to get their jobs done.
Right. And so when is disclosure the right thing to do?
I think it is always wiser, in my experience, to be upfront that if you are actually in a relationship with someone at work, that you let your direct manager, for example, be aware of that. The only time for most organisations when it's a problem is if there's a direct report line relationship involved. So in other words, if you are suddenly dating your boss or one of your team members, then it's very important that you go and have that conversation and negotiate with the organisation what that means. And often it will mean someone has to actually move jobs.
Right, and you may have touched on this already slightly, but number 2 rule that you have is be aware of your company policies.
That's right. So it's about being educated. Often we get swept away in these situations. I mean, let's be honest, it's exciting when you find that new spark, and certainly if you're getting lots of attention, and, people really can get distracted and swept up in that. But, it's important that you stop and understand what are the rules of engagement around this in the workplace. And, clearly your policies, your HR policies are the place to start. And if they're not written down, go and have the conversation with someone that you think is in a position to explain. Yes,
and that brings me to number 3. So you've got to understand workplace laws, and you've already mentioned sexual harassment, and that can be, I guess, a tricky one. You being someone who has dealt with people management and specialised in it, is that the trickiest one for people to understand?
Yeah, look, I think it is, and some of the really problematic scenarios that I have seen is when, one party is arguing that the relationship started consensually. There was absolutely, something that they both wanted. Then something sours, and one person's then saying, no, I felt coerced, I felt that, I needed to pursue that, or I felt pressured, or whatever the case may be. Now, there might be some truth in that person's statements, but, again, I often see that, the other person at times is quite genuinely surprised by that. So again, it can be a minefield that, we just need to be very careful as we're stepping through, that we are very aware as to whether or not for example, there's a power imbalance or some reason where someone might feel coerced or, having to be in that situation. So again, be educated, be aware that those problems can arise.
You're on Afternoons with Paula Kruger on Valentine's Day, and with you is HR expert Karen Gately. She is founder of Corporate Dojo and is a leadership and people management specialist. Karen, this brings us to number 4, and I've put this in capital letters, and it, maybe you could make it rule number 5 and number 6 and number 7 as well. Rule number 4 is don't date the boss.
Yes. Look, again, as we've talked about, there is an inherent power imbalance in that relationship, and it causes all sorts of concerns. It's likely to be against company policy. From the boss's perspective, maintaining credibility, that you are making good judgment calls, there's no favoritism involved because you're involved with one of your team members, there's no inappropriate pillow talk. All of that becomes areas of concern quite reasonably for a lot of employers. So, as an individual, you need to recognise that if you do fall for your boss and that it's something that you are very serious about pursuing, then the simple reality is you can't stay in that working relationship. So either they need to move to another position or you do. Again, I have actually seen people date the boss and end up marrying them and being very happy that they did. But in all of those circumstances, they've had to act very maturely, full disclosure, and allow the organisation to make those reasonable decisions.
Yeah, and the final rule is assess the risk. Is this where you need one of your sensible friends, clear-headed, level-headed, sensible friends to help you through this process?
Yeah, that's right. Again, sometimes we need to be aware when we are potentially not thinking clearly, and certainly when we're falling in love can be a great example of that. So again, seeking the advice that you need, the guidance, checking yourself and whether or not the course of action you're taking is reasonable, is again wise.
Karen, it's been great going through these with you, and I know that we've kind of listed them off, but it's almost like if you're in the relationship already, it's harder to take in this advice and information than, say, before or afterwards.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, again, it's about being disciplined, right, and understanding that the choices you're making about how you are behaving will impact the reality that you create at work. So if you are already in the relationship, if you think there are things that are concerning, so people may be having question marks around your relationship or concerned about the way you're conducting yourselves, then you need to be honest with yourself. You need to actually, have a look in the mirror and recognise whether or not the way in which you are conducting this relationship is undermining your credibility, your professional brand, or ultimately your effectiveness. And if it's not, then, I think you can be confident in having that conversation again with your manager that, if they do have concerns, there's no conflict of interest, then ask them to make you aware of, their concerns and ways in which, they may be feeling that it's inappropriate, and obviously take that feedback on board.
Karen, thanks so much for joining us today. That's Karen Gately, founder of Corporate Dojo, and she's also a leadership and people management specialist. You're on Afternoons with Paula Kruger.